August 19th, 1942, just before dawn. Somewhere along the tangled northern coast of the island, the Japanese called Arashi-jima, a place so choked with jungle that even moonlight died before reaching the ground. Second Lieutenant Hiroto Masanaga of the 9th Independent Gun Platoon paused at the edge of the trees and wrote a single line in his pocket diary, a line that would later read less like an observation and more like a warning. "Something here feels wrong." Hours earlier, Masanaga and nearly 1,000 men of Colonel Tadao Morikawa's reinforced detachment had slipped ashore from fast destroyers, their boots sinking silently into black volcanic sand, their rifles wrapped in oilcloth, their confidence absolute. Tokyo had assured them this would be a formality. The enemy, they were told, numbered no more than 2,000, clerks in uniform, boys with soft hands, frightened, disorganized, unfit for jungle war. Morikawa repeated the promise with a smile that never reached his eyes. "These Americans will break at the first scream. We will drive them into the sea before the sun rises." None of the men landing that night had reason to doubt him. They were veterans of Shanghai, of Malaya, of the Philippines. They had mastered night attacks, infiltration, bayonet charges. Darkness belonged to them. The jungle obeyed them, or so they believed. What awaited them beyond the palms was not merely resistance, not even defeat, but the violent collapse of everything the Imperial Army thought it understood about modern war. 2 weeks earlier, on August 6th, the war on Arashi-jima had quietly changed direction when over 10,000 United States Marines of the 2nd Marine Division stormed ashore at Koru Bay, under a sky thick with naval gun smoke. Their commander, Major General Thomas Hale, had been given brutally simple orders: seize the unfinished airstrip inland, fortify it, and hold no matter the cost. The landing met scattered resistance and confusion rather than fury. Japanese labor units and naval guards vanished into the jungle, abandoning bulldozers, fuel drums, crates of ammunition, and most importantly, the half-built runway that would soon be renamed Falcon Field. By the evening of the first day, American engineers were already leveling coral and laying steel matting under flickering lantern light. Within days, aircraft would begin landing, and the island would transform from an outpost into a fortress. Yet victory came poisoned. On the night of August 8th, as Marines dug shallow foxholes and counted dwindling rations, Rear Admiral Isoroku Tanabe led a cruiser force through the narrow straits west of the island, using rain squalls and darkness like a cloak. What followed was a slaughter. Allied warships were caught unready, guns unmanned, radars misunderstood. In less than an hour, 3 American heavy cruisers and 1 Allied cruiser burned and sank, their crews trapped below decks as fuel and ammunition detonated. Over 1,000 sailors died screaming in oil-slicked water. The surviving ships fled east, taking with them desperately needed food, artillery shells, and medical supplies. When dawn broke, the Marines on Arashi-jima realized the truth with sickening clarity. They were alone, undersupplied, surrounded, and now hunted. And it was into this tightening noose, under these false assumptions and broken certainties, that Colonel Morikawa's men marched inland believing they were about to crush a frightened enemy, unaware that the jungle had already chosen a side, and that the battle waiting for them would not end before sunrise, but would instead mark the beginning of a nightmare from which neither army would emerge unchanged. What the commanders in Tokyo failed to comprehend during those fevered days of early August was that Falcon Field had become the hinge upon which the entire Pacific balance now swung. Whoever controlled that scar of coral and steel controlled the daylight seas. From its runway, American aircraft could strike any ship within 200 miles, turning slow transports into floating coffins and forcing the Imperial Navy to retreat beneath the horizon when the sun rose. This single reality poisoned every Japanese decision that followed. The Empire could dominate the night, slipping men and supplies down the coast aboard high-speed destroyers in desperate shuttle runs the Marines would later nickname the Shadow Route. But dawn belonged to the Americans. Every sunrise tightened the noose. Time was now the enemy. The airfield had to be taken immediately, before fortifications hardened and aircraft multiplied. Responsibility fell to Lieutenant General Masao Kuroda and his newly formed Southern Detachment, operating out of the distant fortress of Guadalcanal. Kuroda's resources were painfully thin. One brigade was still unloading in the Carolines, another regiment was scattered across garrison duties in the Philippines. The nearest combat-ready force was Colonel Shinjiro Aokawa's 29th Infantry Regiment, veterans originally earmarked for an operation that had died with the Japanese carrier fleet 2 months earlier. Aokawa was a respected instructor at the Army War College, admired for his aggressive doctrine and absolute faith in morale as the supreme weapon. He was also dangerously impatient. His orders were explicit: land a forward element, conduct reconnaissance, wait for reinforcements, then strike in overwhelming force. Aokawa never intended to wait. Every report he had ever read confirmed his beliefs. Western soldiers relied on machines. They hesitated without orders. They collapsed when pressed at night. On the evening of August 18th, 6 destroyers slid silently toward the coast east of Falcon Field and unloaded 920 men of Aokawa's advance battalion near a nameless spit of sand later marked on American maps as Red Cove. The landing went flawlessly. No flares, no gunfire, no resistance. To Aokawa, it felt like confirmation of everything he believed. Reconnaissance patrols were dispatched inland almost immediately, probing west along jungle trails and coastal tracks, confident they were ghosts moving through an empty island. Less than 24 hours later, that illusion shattered. On the morning of August 19th, a reinforced patrol from Company C, 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines, under Captain Andrew Lowell, was sweeping east along a narrow coastal path toward Sparrow Point when movement flickered in the trees ahead. The clash was sudden and merciless. Rifles cracked at close range. Grenades burst among roots and vines. The Japanese patrol fought hard, but was cut down almost to a man. 30 bodies lay tangled in the undergrowth when the firing stopped. More devastating than the bodies were the papers pulled from their packs. Maps, orders, strength estimates. All of them wrong. All of them revealing that the enemy believed the Marine perimeter was thin, disorganized, weak. Lowell ran the documents back through choking heat and sucking mud without stopping. When Major General Hale read them, he did not hesitate. The picture was clear. An attack was coming. It would come fast. It would come from the east, and it would come from an enemy marching confidently toward annihilation, unaware that every assumption guiding them was already dead. General Hale acted without delay. He ordered Colonel Matthew Rowland to harden the eastern perimeter along a narrow sand spit where a shallow river met the sea, a place the Marines called the Vireo Creek, though its true name was something else entirely and would soon be forgotten. Rowland anchored the defense with Lieutenant Colonel Samuel Breen's 3rd Battalion, 6th Marines, dug in along the riverbank with overlapping machine gun nests angled to rake the exposed sandbar from end to end. Fields of fire were calculated, distances measured, kill zones rehearsed in silence. What followed would become one of the most brutally lopsided engagements in Marine Corps history. Colonel Aokawa, refusing to accept that his reconnaissance patrol had vanished without report and dismissing any notion of delay, chose immediate action. During the night of August 20th, sliding into the early hours of August 21st, he ordered a direct frontal assault straight across the open sandbar. Japanese doctrine promised victory through willpower, shock, and relentless night aggression. Aokawa believed his men could shatter the American line with speed and spirit, close the distance, and finish the fight with bayonets and grenades where they had never failed before. Just after midnight, a battered island scout named Leka Manoa staggered into Marine positions, his body torn from hours of interrogation, his message barely whispered before he collapsed. The enemy was moving. Minutes later, the jungle erupted. Hundreds of Japanese soldiers surged out of the darkness, shouting battle cries, firing wildly, hurling grenades as they sprinted across the sand. They ran straight into a carefully engineered slaughter. Water-cooled Browning heavy machine guns roared to life, their barrels glowing faintly as belts fed endlessly through them. Each weapon hammered the sandbar with disciplined fury, sweeping left and right, overlapping arcs until there was nowhere to hide. Men fell by the dozens, then by the hundreds, bodies tumbling into shallow water already slick with blood. Those who somehow crossed the open ground met 37mm guns loaded with canister, blasts that tore through human formations like storms of steel, reducing charges to screaming wreckage. Still the attacks came. For hours, wave after wave pressed forward, driven by officers screaming orders no one could obey. A handful reached the Marine line, and there the fighting turned feral. Rifles became clubs, knives flashed, men grappled in mud and blood under flickering muzzle flashes. But the line never broke. The interlocking fire held, merciless and absolute. By the time the eastern sky began to pale, the assault was finished. The sandbar was carpeted with the dead. More than 800 Japanese soldiers lay motionless or dying along the river mouth, their attack annihilated. Dawn brought no mercy. Hale ordered a counterstroke. Elements of the 2nd Battalion, 6th Marines advanced with 5 M3 light tanks grinding forward across the sand. The tanks prowled through the coconut groves beyond the river, coaxing out survivors with bursts of machine gun fire and blasting clusters of men with canister rounds at point-blank range. An embedded reporter watching from behind the line would later write that it was like watching men scatter before a mechanical predator, flame and smoke marking each sudden turn. By midday on August 21st, the fighting was over. Of the more than 900 Japanese soldiers who had landed days earlier, barely 100 escaped into the jungle, most from rear echelon elements that had never reached the battlefield. A frantic radio transmission reached Southern Detachment Headquarters, describing destruction beyond comprehension. Colonel Iokawa was dead. Some said he burned his unit colors and took his own life. Others claimed he died charging forward with his sword raised. The truth disappeared into the smoke. Marine losses were minimal by comparison, fewer than 50 killed or wounded. But the true impact was not measured in numbers. The most unsettling truth revealed itself not in prisoner interrogations or intelligence summaries, but in the quiet examination of what the Americans left behind on the battlefield. Japanese officers moved among the wreckage after the river disaster and understood, with mounting dread, that they had been fighting an enemy whose material strength bordered on the incomprehensible. American machine guns functioned with mechanical indifference to heat, dirt, and continuous fire. Barrels were changed, water jackets refilled, ammunition belts stacked like bricks. Nothing jammed, nothing failed. Every Marine carried more cartridges than a Japanese platoon had fired in an entire engagement. Artillery support appeared as if summoned by thought alone, shells landing with terrifying precision, coordinated seamlessly with infantry movement and even naval guns firing from beyond the horizon. This was not courage overwhelming fear. This was a system, engineered, rehearsed, and brutally efficient. Even as this realization spread, the machinery of the Japanese counteroffensive was already grinding forward. From distant anchorages, Admiral Kenji Nakamura assembled a desperate naval effort to reclaim Falcon Field before American air power grew unmanageable. Slow transports carrying the shattered remnants of the earlier regiment departed under escort, but when one was mauled by American carrier aircraft during a chaotic sea battle east of the island, command made a fateful decision. The era of transports was over. Speed would replace sustainability. Destroyers would run the gauntlet at night, unloading men like cargo and vanishing before dawn. The night shuttle, as crews grimly called it, delivered thousands of soldiers between late August and early September, including nearly 5,000 men of Major General Reizo Tanegawa's 36th Infantry Brigade, pouring them ashore with rifles, grenades, and little else. It was a logistical triumph and a strategic curse. Artillery stayed behind. Vehicles never arrived. Food was scarce from the moment boots hit the sand. Ammunition was rationed from the start. Men marched inland already hungry, already weakened, already gambling their lives on a swift victory that never came. Tanigawa fixed September 12th as the decisive blow. His plan was elegant on paper. One force would strike the coastal flank, another would push through jungle from the southwest. The main effort would come from the south, advancing along a narrow inland ridgeline that rose above Falcon Field like a dagger pointed at the heart of the American position. What Tanigawa did not realize was that American intelligence had already circled that ridge in red pencil. Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Mercer, commander of the 2nd Raider Battalion, had confirmed it days earlier during a lightning strike on a coastal village that uncovered supply dumps stacked for miles. The enemy was massing. The route was obvious. Mercer did not hesitate. He asked for the ridge. General Hale granted it. On September 10th and 11th, fewer than 900 Marines from the Raiders and a composite airborne battalion climbed onto the coral spine and began turning it into a fortress. Machine guns were dragged into place by hand. Mortars were registered by compass and instinct. Artillery batteries inland plotted defensive fires that overlapped the ridge like invisible walls. Every ravine, every saddle, every approach was memorized. The terrain itself seemed to breathe menace. The ridge stretched 1,000 meters, broken into 3-knuckled hills, flanked by ravines so steep and choked with vegetation that daylight barely reached the bottom. It was a textbook infiltration route. It was also, if held, a trap without escape. On the night of September 12th, the jungle came alive. Japanese infantry slipped through the ravines in silence, moving in small units, feeling for seams, searching for hesitation. When contact came, it was sudden and vicious. Grenades exploded among foxholes. Screams echoed and vanished. Machine guns hammered from unseen positions. In the choking darkness, Marines often realized the enemy had breached the perimeter only when a grenade clattered into a foxhole, or a shadow rose suddenly at arm's length. The fighting collapsed into moments of pure instinct, hands grappling, bayonets flashing, bodies colliding in mud and blood. Yet the defenses held because they had been built to endure exactly this chaos. Whenever Japanese units gathered for a coordinated push, American mortars answered within seconds, their rounds walking up ravines and across slopes with deadly accuracy, while artillery thundered from the rear in a relentless rhythm. Throughout the night, batteries of the 12th Marines fired more than 2,000 shells, some landing so close that fragments cut down friendly troops, a grim price accepted without hesitation. Machine gun teams fired until the metal scorched their palms, swapping barrels by touch alone. Individual Marines fought as isolated points of resistance, emptying rifles, drawing pistols, then knives, then entrenching tools, refusing to give ground even when surrounded. Master Sergeant Eli Navarro, the same island scout who had staggered in with the warning weeks earlier, moved fearlessly through the lines, shouting encouragement, pointing out infiltration routes, dragging wounded men to cover. At a critical bend along the ridge, Corporal Daniel Russo manned a heavy machine gun whose fire became the anchor of the defense. When his crew was cut down one by one, Russo stayed at the weapon alone, feeding belts, clearing jams, firing until dawn, breaking attack after attack that threatened to collapse the line. He would later be awarded the nation's highest decoration, one of 2 earned on that ridge, alongside dozens of other citations that could never fully capture the night's violence. When morning light crept across the coral spine on September 13th, the Japanese assault had failed, but Major General Tanigawa still believed victory possible. He had reserves left. He would try again. Colonel Mercer shortened his lines, pulling his battered units toward the center hill, consolidating under constant harassment. Reinforcements arrived just in time, swelling the defense to roughly 2,500 men. When night fell again, the Japanese returned with desperation bordering on frenzy. The second assault was worse than the first. Attacks came in rapid succession, screaming charges dissolving under machine gun fire, men dying in heaps that blocked their own advance. Several penetrations reached within 50 yards of Mercer's command post before being crushed. At one moment, when a sector wavered, Mercer seized a rifle and stepped into the firing line himself, shouting orders through explosions and tracer fire. Once again, preparation and firepower decided the outcome. By dawn on September 14th, the offensive had shattered. Hundreds of Japanese bodies lay strewn across the ridge and ravines below. Between 800 and 900 attackers were dead. Marine losses were severe but bearable, just over 100 killed and several hundred wounded. The ridge, known thereafter by both sides under different names, became a permanent scar in the memory of every man who fought there. For the Japanese survivors, the lesson was devastating and unmistakable. Diaries recovered later spoke of disbelief, of shock at discovering that night no longer belonged to them, that courage alone could not overcome guns, shells, and coordination beyond their reach. They had expected fear. They found discipline. They expected chaos. They met structure. The battles along the river mouth and the ridge fixed the pattern of the campaign. Japanese forces would attack with bravery, infiltration, and sacrifice. American forces would answer with preparation, overlapping fire, artillery, and combined arms. The outcome repeated itself with merciless consistency. Yet even these terrible numbers failed to express the full cruelty of Guadalcanal, because the island itself fought without allegiance. Disease spread faster than bullets. Captured Japanese papers recovered months later told a story more terrifying than any battlefield report. A regimental surgeon's memorandum dated late October described an army already dying in place. More than 60% of the Southern Army's remaining strength on the island was incapacitated by disease, hunger, or exhaustion. Entire companies existed only on paper. Effective combat power had fallen to barely a third of authorized strength. Men were dying at a rate of nearly 50 per day, most without ever firing another shot. Hunger hollowed faces into skulls. Fever broke bodies faster than bullets. Meanwhile, on the opposite side of the lines, American logistics had finally found their rhythm. Under the protective umbrella of Falcon Field, supply ships arrived regularly, unloading crates of food, ammunition, medicine, and replacement weapons. Early shortages had been real and dangerous, but they passed. By October, Marines ate enough to fight. Rations were dull, repetitive, and hated, but they sustained life. Ammunition was abundant enough that machine gun crews burned through belts without restraint, replacing worn barrels as casually as changing socks. Field hospitals expanded. Surgeons operated under electric lights. Plasma restored blood. Sulfa drugs stopped infections, and the worst cases were evacuated off the island entirely. Japanese logistics, by contrast, never recovered. Destroyers could carry men, not sustenance. Soldiers learned to make a single rice ball last an entire day. Ammunition was rationed so strictly that some units were ordered to fire only at point-blank range. Medical treatment meant a strip of cloth if available. Amputations were performed with clenched teeth and prayers. Many wounded were handed grenades and left behind, instructed to die quietly rather than slow the column or risk capture. In late October, the Japanese command gambled everything on one final offensive. Lieutenant General Masaru Okabe arrived personally to direct the operation, bringing battle-hardened veterans pulled from years of fighting on the Asian mainland. The plan was ambitious, coordinated, and desperate. Attacks would strike from multiple directions, with the decisive blow once again coming from the south through jungle and ravines that had already swallowed thousands of lives. This time, more men would attack. This time, limited artillery and armor would support them. The offensive opened with a thrust along the western river line. A rare armored column of 9 tanks rolled forward, engines roaring defiantly through mud and scrub. They were destroyed within minutes. Anti-tank guns punched through armor. Artillery shells detonated among them. An American light tank joined the slaughter. None survived. The main assault erupted on the night of October 24th. Nearly 6,000 Japanese soldiers advanced through darkness and rain toward the southern perimeter of Falcon Field. They were met by a thin but unbreakable line of Marines and newly arrived Army infantry under Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Hale, men who had learned the island's lessons in blood. The fighting became relentless. Attacks came in waves that blurred together until time lost meaning. Breakthroughs were met with immediate countercharges. Machine gunners fired until springs failed, then fought on with rifles. Artillery dropped shells so close that blast concussion knocked defenders flat. Offshore, an American battleship waited silently, its guns trained inland, ready to erase entire grid squares if called. At one moment, only a single battalion stood between the attackers and the airfield itself. It held. A senior non-commissioned officer, already marked by earlier battles, became the hinge of the defense once again. When ammunition ran low, he ran through fire to resupply his guns. When weapons jammed, he repaired them under fire. When a position collapsed, he led a counterattack with pistol and voice, alone. By dawn, the jungle fell silent. The offensive had failed. The attacking general lay dead among his men.